While we're in Queensland, because that was an event in Queensland, a large tract of Queensland has now been given over to the local Aboriginal population, or a certain portion of them anyway, through native title. We're talking about 7,800 square kilometres worth of land that stretches its way towards Rockhampton. It's the Barada, Kabalbara, Yeti Malara people, and I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that correctly, but they've been given native title over this land through the federal court this month after a 10-year fight. Now, of course, what happens with native title is someone makes an application claiming that they have an ancestral connection to this land. In this case, it's a small group of people who have traced their ancestry back to 5 people who they say were on the land at this time, and that then gives them the rights to perform certain ceremonies and have certain use of the land. Now, they don't have freehold access to land, of course, under native title, but what it does give them is the ability to camp on the land, it gives them the ability to hunt on the land, and of course it allows them to make money off the land. And this is where it becomes important. They can't use it for commercial purposes, but what happens now is you have these Aboriginal land corporations set up, and they then deal with government outfits and electricity companies and whatever when they look to do any kind of work on the land. And we've seen a few examples of this out of South Australia, particularly the Barngala people, who of course were successful in scuppering a nuclear waste dump near Kimba because they had so much money in the bank that they were able to go off to the court and fight it. Now they're also fighting against a desalination plant because they say the place where it will go will interrupt some old fish traps in the water. And the way these land corporations make their money is by doing deals with big business, particularly electricity companies and mining companies that want to do stuff on the land. You know, they do cultural studies and they advise them on where they should or should not go. And for that, they get millions and millions of dollars. So through native title, they actually build up a big bank by which they can start dictating to government and everyone else what they should and should not be allowed to do. I have no issue with saying, sure, come through and hunt on the land. I particularly couldn't give a toss. But when it starts turning into a venture that allows these land corporations that operate under different corporate law to the rest of corporate Australia, and if you go through and read some of their annual reports, it's a bit murky as to where the money goes. But they have real power now because of these.
If it's done properly, I have absolutely no problem with this whatsoever. As you say, there are often question marks over exactly how that money is spent and who it goes to, and there's often competing voices in the community. There's often competing elders. So, for example, there might be a bunch of people, and you see this often with, you know, Twiggy Forest Mines, quite famously, where you have a bunch of Aboriginal people who desperately want the mine to go ahead because they want the jobs that go with it and the betterment that go with it, and you have Aboriginal businesses that are often prioritised in these projects, as they should be, and that's good because we want to do things like tackle Indigenous employment and tackle Indigenous education, make sure that these guys, you know, have as much of a strong future here as the rest of us. So often, you know, Indigenous people aren't just one sort of homogenous thing that all thinks the same way.
We know that.
And again, sometimes, look, we all know there were things like, you know, the ridiculousness of the secret women's business decades ago that stopped
the Hindmarsh Island
bridge being built to Hindmarsh Island. But if it's legit and if it's actually doing it, I have no problem whatsoever. You've got, you know, often, you know, big mining companies or energy companies making an absolute mozza out of this land. It has been their land before we came along. If they're taking it and if they're using that money and if they're being reasonable and using that money for the betterment of their people, I have no problem with it whatsoever.
But we don't have any proof that they are.
How much of Queensland isn't native title now? Because I still remember reading a ministerial media, whatever they put out, by Scott Stewart, who was the Minister for Resources back in July 21 for Queensland, saying very proudly that now 1/3 of Queensland was recognised as native title. And I remember thinking at the time, gee whiz, okay, that's a fair whack. Now we're talking about another chunk, and I don't know how much has happened in between that, but we are now talking about ginormous packages of land. Check out this map of the entire nation, which is on the government's website. This is the native title state of play. 10 years ago. They haven't got an updated one on their website. Why is that, government? Mr. Transparency,
When have you been to any of these places?
So blue is the claimant.
Desert.
The claimant native title is approved. The dark green is, the blue is there. There's claims in place. So who knows what that looks like now, because 10 years ago, those claims were in place. The dark green, that is exclusive native title territory. The pale green is non-exclusive native title territory. So when we talk about native title and we talk about these parcels of land now being recognised as a native title, I always just remember this map, because there's already
how does that affect your life in the slightest? None of those
Caleb
places.
just told you how it's affecting our lives. We've got a desalination
No, in terms of people who have millions of square kilometres who want to develop it or want to use it for mining or agriculture or whatever, yes, they have to negotiate.
Well, how's it affecting our lives? You just heard how it's affecting our lives. Nation-building projects are getting scuppered because a handful of Indigenous Australians are saying, no, we don't like it. We don't want it
Things like this get contested all the time. There's a desalination plant that was proposed for Sydney that plenty of people opposed, and it wasn't Indigenous people, it was everyone else.
Well, this is because in the case of the nuclear dump in Canberra, wasn't it?
Kimba.
Kimba, my apologies. I need the residents South Australia.
Canberra sounds a bit too close to Canberra.
The people of Kimba literally went to a vote. Over 60% of them said, yes, we want this nuclear waste dump. It'll bring us jobs, etc., and so on. The Bangala people who got that scuppered weren't included in the vote because they didn't live there. They were actually just reaching far too afield to be like, this thing in Kimba,
there are plenty of people, there are plenty of residents' action groups that are as white as the driven snow that oppose everything, including, it's half the reason we've got a housing shortage.
But opposing medium density housing. They'll be opposing
plenty of mosques, they'll be opposing plenty of nuclear reactors. And I think just to single out one particular group across the entire nation, or many different tribes.
But I can go off and start, and let's use my example. I live in the inner west of Sydney amongst all the lefties, so I don't think my residents group's going to get much support. But I can start the inner west action group or whatever it might be. But I can't just go around making money out of surveys that have been done on the land because, I only have the patch of land that I live in. Whereas, of course, with native title, they get vast tracts of land from which they are then able to make money that flows into these Aboriginal land corporations. Well, they didn't live on it. They weren't there 200 years ago, were they?
100 years.
Well, sure. I mean, my ancestors lived on land near Gawler in South Australia, but I don't have any claim to that land, do I?
But land that your parents had would come down to you. You understand that the land gets bequeathed down the generations, right? You have a will. You might get your parents' house when they pass on. You might give your house to them down the track. You know how that works, right?
Yes.
So
it's a very different system, but sure.
So that like terra nullius no longer applies.
Yeah, but are you suggesting...
They had the land.
Yeah, but are you...
And then we've come...
But are you suggesting that from that point onwards that Aboriginal people have been removed from the ability to gain freehold land? They haven't.
No, but they have been removed from the land that they lived on.
Yeah, but what do you think happened in every other country on the face of the planet when someone else moved in and took it over?
All native title says is, all right, you just have to consult these people on these things. And yes, sometimes money changes hands, or sometimes people want projects to go ahead. Sometimes they don't want projects to go ahead. It's not a cookie cutter approach where they're just blocking everything. And usually when they're blocking something that everyone else wants, it gets called out and it gets found out. And that's why you have things like the Hindmarsh Bridge or like the nuclear dump site. But I guarantee you there'll be plenty of non-Indigenous people who wouldn't want a nuclear dump site anywhere near their land.
They are not a small handful of people who, by virtue of their
handful of residents' action groups blocking stuff. Look at Western Sydney Airport. Look at Western Sydney Airport. It took 70 years to get off the ground because of a small handful.
Now you're just talking about massive
people complaining about aircraft noise.
In the past. Oh, come on.
No, just
it is not comparable, and you know it. That was not
How is it not comparable?
Of native title. That's a pile of people saying, I don't want planes.
That's a pile of residents saying, we don't want.
They are valid concerns. Everyone's like, I don't want the value of my house because I'm in the flight path being made
So
less.
we should have blocked the airport from people who bought their house there after it had already been zoned for an airport, but we should not even consult with people who have lived on the land for tens of thousands of years before we came along.
They have never, this generation of Indigenous Aussies have never lived on the land in the way that you're describing. As far as I'm concerned, and as far as many Aussies are concerned, they have no more claim to the land. Then you
Go and visit them. You can still see them. They're there.
But they're not all living in the communities, Joe. You know that.
Who are you talking about now?
The people who end up in charge of these Aboriginal land corporations that then run these cases, they don't all live in the community. I didn't say none of them. Not all of them live in the communities. You know that.
You're a better argument.
You know that, Joe.
Most of them do.